The Trip. Chapter 8. The Chain. The folder had been sitting on the left side of Ethan's desk for 4 days. Left side was his system, the holding pattern for things he planned to deal with after they stopped mattering. A contractor's bill, a partner retreat notice, noise that evaporated if you gave it enough silence. Conflict check, urgent, red label, standard compliance formatting. But 4 days was long for a red label, even by his standards, and when he picked it up on Friday morning, the paper inside felt heavier than paper should. He opened it. A client onboarding packet from the corporate integration team, Delaware LLC, Ridgemont Partners, requesting representation in a structured acquisition. Compliance had flagged it. Ridgemont's principal entity shared a registered agent with a trust already on file through the Carlson/Millard merger. Routine. This happened twice a quarter. He could have forwarded it to the partner, CC'd compliance, and moved on before his coffee cooled. Except the registered agent was in Red Hook. Ethan set the folder down, picked up a pen, put it back. Red Hook. Not Feedy, not Midtown, not any of the addresses that belonged in a corporate acquisition chain. Red Hook was converted warehouses and holding companies that preferred to be looked up rather than found. He pulled the agent's filing on the state database, cross-referenced it with the Carlson/Millard Trust documents. The structure was layered, LLC wrapped in a trust wrapped in a holding company, the kind of architecture designed not to be read in one sitting. You'd need to know what you were looking for, or you'd need to suspect. Julian, at the Oyster Bar a week ago. Ashevale Capitals sniffing. East of 6th, Restoration adjacent. His own handwriting, crossed out on the legal pad still in his briefcase. Ghost owners? He hadn't thrown the pad away. He hadn't uncrossed the words either. They sat in their struck-through state like a thought that wanted to be wrong. Ethan opened ACRIS, the city's property record system. Typed the address Julian had mentioned, the landmark building on 57th. The page loaded slowly, the way government databases do, as if bureaucracy were baked into the connection speed. Changed hands 14 months ago. Buyer, a Delaware trust. Registered agent, Red Hook, same address. He stared at the screen long enough for the screensaver to threaten, then closed the tab, cleared the history, and shut the laptop with the careful pressure of someone closing a door they might need to reopen. The Tylenol bottle sat on his desk, label out, catching light. 3 fountain pens aligned east-west. The penfolds pad, untouched, everything in its place. Everything arranged to suggest a man in control. He didn't forward the compliance flag, didn't write anything down. Instead, he picked up the folder, slid it into his briefcase alongside the legal pad with its crossed-out words, and left it there, sealed, portable, and his. At the Ledger, the Friday newsroom had the feel of a theater between shows. Half the desks dark. The ones still lit held reporters who either had deadlines or nowhere better to be. Daniel had both. He'd been mapping connections that didn't want to be mapped. 6 Midtown buildings, layered Delaware trusts, a partnership between a Scandinavian firm and a holding company based, of all places, in Red Hook. The legal pad on his desk looked like evidence in a conspiracy trial, except the conspiracy was real estate and the defendant was a corporate structure designed never to sit in a courtroom. Marcia appeared at 9:30. He got 8 minutes. He pitched it standing. This isn't a real estate story. One entity has acquired 6 Midtown buildings through layered trusts in 14 months. They've partnered with Oris, Scandinavian, clean energy adjacent. The structures are built so that no single filing reveals the full picture. You'd need to read all of them together, and nobody does. What's the angle? Control. Someone is assembling quiet leverage over a section of Midtown, and they've engineered it to be invisible from any single vantage point. Marcia's silence was different from Ethan's. His was withholding. Hers was calculation. What do you need? Second confirmation on the Aris link, corporate filings, SEC or Stockholm, and someone who reads LLC architecture, not just what's filed, but what the filing is designed to hide. She studied him. Wednesday, bring a spine. After she left, Daniel sat and reopened Charlotte's text. Days old now. Watch Midtown on Monday. Success criteria. Charlotte didn't send tips. She sent coordinates. Success criteria was boardroom language. She was telling him what to measure without saying what she'd moved, which meant she'd moved something. And Monday was a deadline, not a suggestion. He wrote in the margin of his pad, Charlotte's Monday, what fires? Then turned back to the map. 6 addresses, 1 holding company, a web that kept widening without ever showing its center. Ethan left the office before 6, which on a Friday was still late enough to suggest dedication, but early enough that no one would remember seeing him go. He walked out through the revolving doors into the kind of October evening that New York does better than most cities, cold enough to sharpen the edges of things, the light going copper along the tops of buildings while the streets below had already given up and started rehearsing night. He didn't go home. The 4 trained to Borough Hall, south on Henry Street, through the door at Henry Public with the quiet confidence of a man entering a room where no one was waiting for him. Dark wood, low wattage, a bartender who could read a customer's evening from the way they pulled out a stool. Woodford, neat. No food, no second drink, just the glass and the slow uncoiling of a thought he'd been holding since 11 a.m. Red Hook. Delaware Trust, same registered agent on a compliance flag and a building sale. The kind of pattern that looked like noise until you saw the shape, and once you saw the shape, it was the only thing in the room. He thought about Daniel. Not the way you think about a friend between meetings, loose, backgrounded, but with the specific weight of someone holding information that might belong to someone else's work. Daniel's line at dinner about moving noise around. It had sounded philosophical at the time. Now it sounded like something closer to a frequency check. Ethan picked up his phone, scrolled to Daniel's name, typed something careful. Read it back, deleted half of it, retyped, shorter. The kind of message that said just enough to open a door without stepping through it. He sent it before the bourbon was finished, set the phone face down on the bar, left the glass for the bartender to clear. The Hudson at 6:30 on a Friday in October looks like it's been told a secret and is deciding whether to keep it. Low light, copper film on the water, New Jersey almost glowing across the gap. The kind of view that made you forget you were looking at another state. Daniel walked south along the Greenway with his canvas bag on one shoulder and a week's worth of unanswered questions on the other. He'd been walking this stretch since his first year at the Ledger, back when Hell's Kitchen still had rent he could pretend was reasonable, and Times Square still felt like a dare he hadn't accepted. The Greenway was his processing corridor. Something about the river's indifference helped sort what mattered from what was just loud. Tonight, what mattered was the map. 6 buildings, 6 trusts, 1 holding company in Red Hook, a Scandinavian partnership that filed under strategic integration, and Charlotte's 6 words sitting in his phone like a timer he couldn't read. A cyclist passed close enough to clip the strap of his bag. He didn't flinch. Years of New York had trained the startle reflex out of him, or maybe journalism had. The slow accretion of proximity to things that move fast and don't care if you're ready. He passed Pier 84, where a wedding party was posing against the railing in defiance of the temperature. The bride's veil catching the last river light, the photographer kneeling lower than the occasion probably deserved. Daniel walked behind them without slowing. A habit born of years spent in rooms where his presence was either useful or invisible, never decorative. South of the Intrepid, the Greenway thinned. Joggers replaced tourists. A man in a Patagonia vest ran past, talking into AirPods with the strained enthusiasm of someone whose life coach charged by the minute. A woman sat cross-legged on a bench with a library copy of Robert Caro spread open on her lap. The Power Broker, the one about Moses, about how a single man reshaped New York's infrastructure without anyone voting for it. Daniel clocked the spine the way he clocked all spines. Occupational disease. He thought about Marcia's deadline. Wednesday. 5 days to build a story that had taken 14 months to conceal. He had the shape, the filings, Charlotte's coordinates. What he didn't have was someone who could read the legal architecture from the inside. Someone who understood why you'd nest an LLC inside a trust, inside a holding company, and what the nesting was designed to protect. He knew someone like that. He ate dinner with someone like that every Thursday. His phone buzzed. He pulled it out, read the name, then the message. Stopped walking. Ethan didn't reach out like this. Ethan communicated in logistics, confirmations, times, locations. He didn't open lines that might need to be followed. He didn't leave questions hanging in someone else's evening. But this was Ethan leaning forward. And Daniel understood, with the same instinct that told him when a source was about to flip, that something had changed on the other side. Not what, just that. Ethan had found something, in his world, through the particular architecture of his work. Something that rhymed with what Daniel had been building alone for days. He read the message again. The words were careful. Ethan's words always were. But the act of sending them wasn't. Ethan didn't reach. Ethan received. That was the architecture of their friendship. Daniel checked in. Ethan responded with dry warmth, and the structure held its shape without anyone testing its load-bearing walls. This tested them. He stood at the railing near Pier 66. A Circle Line boat slid past, half empty, its recorded narration bleeding across the water in tinny fragments. Something about the Statue of Liberty, something about freedom, the words dissolving before they reached shore. The river moved the way rivers do, carrying everything the city dropped into it without appearing to move at all. Daniel thought about Peter Klein, not the midnight call, the lesson before it. Years ago, in the Beacon's cramped office on Brattle Street, Klein had pinned an index card above the coffee machine. 3 words. Stories cost friendships. Daniel had been 24 and thought it was about courage. Now, at 35, he understood it was about grief. The story would take whatever it needed, and what it took didn't come back the same. He didn't reply. Not strategy, not caution exactly, more the recognition that the right response wasn't a text. It was a question he needed to ask himself first. What happens when the investigation you're building reaches the table where you eat on Thursdays? He thought about that table. The corner booth at Colony, the way 6 chairs stayed warm even when someone was late. Marcus's energy, Charlotte's calibrated silence, Alice's sharp warmth, Camille's careful grace, Ethan's dry precision that occasionally cracked open into something almost tender. 6 people who had somehow agreed, without ever saying it aloud, that Thursday was sacred, a weekly ceasefire from whatever the city demanded of them the other 6 days. And now the story was inside the ceasefire, not approaching it, already there. Charlotte was inside Stratinia's orbit. Ethan was inside whatever compliance flag had made him pick up his phone in break pattern, and Daniel was the one mapping the connections between them, a cartographer who just realized the territory included his own home. He pocketed the phone and kept walking. Past a couple sharing headphones on a bench, her head on his shoulder, his eyes closed, both synced to something the city couldn't hear. Past the tourist clusters dissolving in the cold, past the little island's tulip petal columns rising white against the darkening sky, an architectural fantasy that looked like the city's attempt at an apology for something. Past a temporary installation near the skate park, mirrored columns that reflected the skyline in fragments, like a city that had been taken apart and couldn't decide how to reassemble itself. Camille's story appeared in the queue, charred cedar from the Tanamura piece, lit from below, the grain of the wood like a topography of something that had survived its own burning. He watched it once, the way you read the last line of a good story, not for information, but for the shape of it. He thought about texting her, something about the installation or the light or nothing, just the gesture of reaching out when your hands are full of someone else's problems. But the text he'd send would be a lie of omission. Every casual message from now on would carry the weight of what he wasn't saying, that he was building a story with their friend's name at its center, and that the table they all loved might not survive what he found. He let the screen go dark. The walk home took him east on 46th, then north on 9th, into the part of Hell's Kitchen that still remembered what it was before the glass towers came. Brick walk-ups with fire escapes like iron ribs. Awnings so faded the colors had become their own shade, somewhere between red and the memory of red. A man sat on a milk crate outside a laundromat, talking into a phone with the animated intensity of someone explaining something important to someone who wasn't listening. Daniel stopped at the bodega on the corner of 50, the one with the cat who slept on the newspaper stack and the fluorescent light that hummed in a key he'd once checked with a tuning app, because that's the kind of thing he did. He bought bread, a wedge of manchego wrapped in wax paper, and a tin of olives from a shelf that hadn't been restocked since the label changed. The cashier rang him up without looking away from a soccer match on a phone propped against the register. Deportivo Cali, from the color of the jerseys. Daniel didn't comment. He understood the dignity of watching something you loved while pretending you weren't. Back on the street, the guitar shop on 48th was dark, its back in 10 minutes sign glowing in the window like a small, permanent lie. He'd passed it for years and never seen anyone inside. It had become a landmark, proof that some things in the city persisted not because they worked, but because no one had bothered to remove them. He thought about Ethan's text the entire walk home, not the words, those he'd already cataloged, but the architecture of the gesture. What makes a man like Ethan break pattern? What kind of discovery rattles someone whose entire professional identity is built on knowing where things go and keeping them there? Something at Baron Gray. Something in the compliance filings, the client trusts, the layered documents that crossed Ethan's desk every week. Ethan had found a thread, and instead of filing it away the way he filed everything, left side of the desk, left side of the heart, he'd picked up his phone and pulled. And he'd pulled toward Daniel. Which meant Ethan suspected that whatever he'd found had a public dimension, something that belonged not to a lawyer's discretion, but to a journalist's attention. He wasn't offering information. He was asking whether someone else was already standing where he'd just arrived. In the apartment, Daniel set the bodega bag on the counter but didn't open it. Stood for a moment in the kitchen, hands flat on the cold tile, staring at the courtyard through the window where nothing moved. The pipes hummed their low mantra. The fridge clicked on and off with the regularity of a metronome nobody had asked for. He ate eventually, standing the way he always did when his mind was elsewhere. Bread torn, not sliced, manchego in uneven pieces, an olive from the tin, then another, eaten with the mechanical rhythm of someone fueling a process rather than enjoying a meal. He thought about Ellie, briefly. You mistake observation for safety, and decided she was still right. He left the food on the counter and went to the desk. The apartment was dark except for the screen's blue glow and the phone beside the keyboard, where Ethan's message still held its small rectangle of light. Daniel left it there, not as sentiment, as a compass reading he wasn't finished with. Because what Ethan had sent pointed somewhere specific, and Daniel had been circling that somewhere for days without looking straight at it. He opened ACRIS, The interface, still the same government blue it had been since someone in 2004 decided that was close enough to trustworthy. Typed the 57th Street address, the landmark building east of 6th, the one Ashvale had been circling, one of 6 pins on his midtown map. The record loaded. 14 months ago, change of ownership. Buyer, a Delaware trust with a 9-word name designed to say nothing. Registered agent, a Red Hook address. He wrote it down, then searched the next building on his list, 54th and Lex. Different trust name, same registered agent, same Red Hook address. The third, 51st, west of 6th. Same. He sat back. The chair gave its familiar creak, the only thing in the apartment that talked back. 3 of the 6, all bought within a 14-month window, all through differently named Delaware trusts, all using the same registered agent in Red Hook, the same address that surfaced in the Oris Strategnia partnership filings, the same thread Peter Klein had pulled from a decade-old investigation in Boston and handed back to Daniel like an inheritance he hadn't asked for. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a system, and systems had architects. He searched the remaining 3 buildings. 2 more came back with the same agent. The 6th used a different one, registered in Wilmington, but the trust's filing date fell within the same 14-month window and the acquisition structure was identical. Trust buys building, trust names agent. Agent's address is a place that exists to make real owners disappear. 5 of 6, possibly all 6. Daniel stared at the screen. He could feel the story assembling itself, not as excitement, which was the outsider's fantasy of journalism, but as weight. The same weight a surgeon must feel when the scan confirms what the symptoms suggested. You wanted to be right, and now you were, and now the work was harder. He picked up a pen. On the legal pad, below the morning's notes, he wrote the chain. Ashvale to Strategnia to 57th Street. Same agent, same address. Added the other buildings in a column. Drew lines connecting them through Red Hook. The page was starting to look like a circuit diagram, which he supposed it was. Money flowing through trusts the way current moves through wire, invisible until you know where to put the meter. He drew an arrow from Strategnia and wrote Oris. From Oris, he drew another arrow. His pen hovered. The next word wasn't a company, it was a person. Someone who worked there, who navigated its corridors with the kind of calm that only came from understanding exactly where the walls were. Someone who sat at their Thursday table and tipped for precision and who had sent him 6 words that now looked less like a tip and more like a confession she'd made in advance. He thought about last Thursday, Charlotte's face when he'd mentioned the Strategnia pilot, the way she hadn't blinked, the way her glass had stayed perfectly level. I see everything about Strategnia's pilot in Midtown. Not denial, not deflection, something closer to a controlled reveal, a door opened exactly wide enough for someone to see through if they were looking. Charlotte knew, had always known, and she'd sent him coordinates instead of a warning, which meant she wanted the structure found. She wanted it mapped, maybe even published, but on her timeline, under her conditions, within whatever strategic framework she'd built for herself inside the thing she was also, from Daniel's angle, a part of. But wanting someone to find the story and being named in the story, those were different countries. And Daniel was standing at the border with a pen in his hand. He didn't write her name. He set the pen down, looked at the phone one more time. Ethan's message still glowing, patient, unanswered. Looked at the chain on the legal pad. 2 friends, 2 threads, converging on the same knot from opposite sides of the city. One through compliance, one through public record, and a third, Charlotte, who had quietly handed them both the thread and stepped back to see who would pull it first. Outside, a car horn held its note a beat too long, the sound of someone who'd run out of patience or hadn't learned how to use it. The note faded. The chain didn't.